Okay, welcome back to the Cinema of Transformation. This is part 2, part B on Casablanca, the inner story. This has everything to do with Rick's heart and how his feelings, how his attitude, and basically wrestling with his inner life has an effect and influences the decisions he makes regarding the outer story. So they're very, very linked, but we're going from the in out. Things move both ways. Things can happen in the outer world that affect us internally, and then that new input can change and alter the way we feel and think inside, which leads to different decisions, which get projected out in the actions that we take. So there's a dynamic flow between the inner and the outer. Can't really separate them entirely, but we can look at them from this lens of the inner story, and it's basically the story of Rick's heart. So his heart is shelled in a shell of cynicism, according to Renault, and we see through him, and this is an interesting thing, we see almost more about Rick through the other characters. Sometimes you just can't look at yourself, and in movies to have a person alone talking about themselves is not... It's not cinematic. We see it in theater, usually a soliloquy where there's one person talking about things, sorting out what's going on in their head and in their heart. Certainly in Hamlet, we have the to be or not to be monologue, which is definitely a soliloquy. But we really see how Rick is, and we see who he is through, yes, what he does and the things that he says, but since he's become so shelled and cut off from his feelings as a protective, defense mechanism, he has a blind spot. So he's not seeing, or probably more correctly, doesn't want to see or accept these parts of himself because he's been wounded by them. And now he has this jaded, very protected shell going around his heart. And he doesn't want to look at that. So we need the other characters to tell us, and more importantly, tell him who he is, help remind him who he once was, and really what his true self is, because he's lost touch with that. Yes, this is a transformation, but in so many transformations, we'll see that what you transform into is really what you were. Now, I'm putting that in quotes because it's so much more. There isn't anything somebody's going to transform into that they didn't at least have the seeds of and shown them previously. So this becoming, this change, you're really changing from the false self to the true self. The change actually happened before when you lost touch with your true self. We see this in childhood when when kids are playing without any, uninhibitedly and laughing and dancing and yelling and screaming, and somebody says, "Oh, don't do that. You got to be quiet." Then it's, now we have to question what it is we do. And throughout life, we can and all the changes, and sometimes some dramatic and traumatic elements that come in can help build this shell, help construct this wall around our feelings so we don't hurt again. It's a very protective thing, but it's also denial of the true self. Now, we may not be ready for it until a certain point or certain phase in our life. And Rick certainly didn't feel he was ready to address these things at the beginning, didn't want to, did everything he could to get away from them. But eventually they still rise up. Either circumstances from the outside intervene, or it arises from within. Often it's both, and they meet in the middle, and it is this middle where we meet Rick, where he is on the cusp of having this breakthrough through his shell, through his wall of cynicism and protection, to let that part of him that he once was come out. And when it does, he's not going back to who he was. He's picking up what he had lost about who he is. He's discarding what he had constructed around him that he is not. And what he becomes is so much more than he ever was or ever thought possible. That's transformation. So let's continue on. Now, we've already introduced the movie last week, so we don't have to go into some of the background information. We've already introduced these characters, so they're familiar to us, but we're going to look at them more on the inside and how these events unfold the inner story. So we have Rick Blaine, the hero. And when we first meet him, the very first image we see, he's smoking, having a drink by himself, playing a game of chess by himself. Just that single image alone tells us something about who this guy is. And we see throughout, or we hear really early on at the beginning that, he never sits down with customers. There's this really great scene with Yvonne at the beginning where he kind of throws her out of the bar. Apparently they had a fling, and she wants to know when she can see him again. And he's like, I don't make plans that far in advance. And we can tell through her that, yes, he had her, doesn't want her, because that's safe. Keeps it on the surface, keeps it from getting too close, because he does not want that from all these wounds he has in the past. But we learned through Rick, and even Major Strausser has a dossier on him, and gives a list of some of the actions that he had taken in the past, rooting for the underdog, running guns for Ethiopia, fighting against the fascists in Spain, I would assume during the Spanish Civil War, because that was in the mid to late 30s. And we're in 1941 now, as a reminder. So he's closed off, and this closedness is what gets opened up. His heart is still there, but it's protected and it's inside. And it's these walls and barriers that get torn down. So as I'd mentioned before, we're going to look at how he goes from the cynicism to sentimentalism and really is selfish to where he risks his own life, almost certain death, this self-sacrifice for love, for unconditional love, because there's no condition there. And as we see, there are three people involved in this love story, and who he sacrifices himself for is pretty incredible. So it's her. It's Ilsa Lund. We've met her, and we know who she is. We know that she's married to Laszlo, but they've had to keep it a secret. Again, here's this secrecy. There's a lot of secrecy and deception, very necessary in times of war. Sometimes necessary in love, necessary in quotes, but it can't be secret forever, because one of the greatest secrets you can keep is the secret from yourself of who you really are. Now, she is always shown in a soft light and very soft tones, but she's not entirely soft herself. She's built up some strengths, and perhaps a little hardened by the war experiences. We see her pull a gun on Rick later on. And we see that she still has feelings for Rick. But she represents, again, the divine feminine, this truth and beauty. What is wholesome, what is pure, what is innocent, what is loving, what is worth fighting for, what is worth sacrificing for. That's her. So it's her, it's Ilsa, the woman, Ilsa, the lover, but it's Ilsa who represents this something greater, something better, something more important than what these men and their wars are working on. This is really an example, as we've seen in these other movies and will continue to see, how having that longing, having that in your heart, and the unfolding of that, and that connecting with that, can make a civilized person out of a beast, can turn a cynic into someone who's sentimental. And that is the role that Ilsa plays in the inner story. Now, she's married to Victor Laszlo, the leader of the French resistance. We know that from before, and that's in the outer story. He's very much a protector, not just a husband, but he really looks out almost in a fatherly sense, perhaps even a father figure to Ilsa. He waited to leave one part in Europe when she was sick. He didn't leave her behind in Paris. There was a lot of times when he could have, and he risked his well-being and his safety for her. So very much has this protector willing to sacrifice himself. And we see this later on with the letters of transit. When everyone's trying to get them from Rick, Victor comes to him and says, look, if you won't give them to me, if you won't sell, he offered money to Rick, but if you won't sell them to me, take Ilsa and get her out of here. He was even willing to do that, even give her up to Rick for her safety. That's unconditional love. That is total protection. Now, Victor plays an incredibly important role with the inner story because, like I said, through Louis Renault and even a little through Strausser, we see a little bit about Rick's history through them, and we need that as a story device for the audience. But what we get out of Victor Laszlo, and it is through him that we really get a sense of who Rick is as a person, not just in his history and what he's done in the outer world, but who he is under the surface. And it's at this point, yes, they're both in love with the same woman, but they're almost two of a feather, as different as they are. Certainly at the beginning, they're very different. They come together at the end, and we can really see it's almost as if Victor, and in some ways Louis Renault, are Rick's better side that's trying to remind him of who he is and inform him about what he should do. He even says, you seem like a man trying to escape from yourself, to Rick. And he says that's something you can never do. And clearly that's what Rick is doing. He was in Paris, now he's in Casablanca, and he's escaping, whether it's in his bar or in the bottle. He is doing everything he can to get away from his feelings. It's not just himself, it's his feelings. And when Victor Laszlo offers or pleads with Rick to have him take Ilsa out of there and leave Victor behind, Rick asks him, says, do you love her that much? And he says, yes. Not only am I a leader of a cause, I'm also a human being. So we see this inner part to Laszlo as well in the movie. Now, Louis Renault is an ally, sometimes an opponent. He's definitely a trickster and shapeshifter. We don't know who he is really aligned with, although we get a sense. He really likes Rick. They're definitely friends. Again, he's the gatekeeper. He controls who can and who cannot leave Casablanca. And as a gatekeeper, one of the price of admission, or I guess the price of exiting, sortie, to leave Casablanca, usually he wants some romantic tryst. If there's a couple involved, he wants to get his own. He wants money too, but he likes women as well. So here we have, Rick and Laszlo and Louis. They all love women, and that's fine. But it also shows us that they have a heart. Maybe it's surface kind of attraction to women that Louis has. Definitely, it's a deep love that Victor has. Laszlo has for Ilsa, and it's a broken heart love that Rick has for Ilsa. So Louis is probably more of a lover than a fighter. He's not all that tough, and Rick knows that and knows how to play him. And they all play each other, really, throughout most of this. Okay, now we have Sam again. Sam, the piano player, has been with Rick a long time. We see this in the flashback in Paris. He's there. He's always there. So we have this loyalty that's not shifting with Sam. And Rick is loyal to him, as well as the other employees of his cafe. And when he sells it to Ferrari, Signor Ferrari, the owner of the Blue Parrot, one of his competitors, he sells the club before he makes his escape. But he made sure that, that Sam gets part of the profits, that Carl, the maitre d', and Sasha, that everybody who works there gets what they need. And so he takes care of them too. So Sam, in addition to being somebody who looks after Rick and looks after Rick's heart, we see in this picture when Ilsa first shows up at the bar, he's playing a happy song and he turns around and sees her walk by, and you can even hear it in the music. It turns into a minor chord and sounds very ominous, what he's playing on the piano. So he knows, and she's there before he does. But Sam also guards his heart. He says, "Oh, she's no good for you, boss. Let's get in the car. We'll drive all night. We'll get drunk. We'll go fishing." He has this very American solution. But this escape, again, more of this escaping. And that's what everybody wants to do in Casablanca, is to escape the difficulties and the oppression in Europe. So there's a lot of this escaping going on here in this movie. But you can't escape from yourself. And that's what Rick tries to do and finds out he can't, so he has to at some point face it. And where he begins to face it is in the departure, this first phase, again, of the hero's journey. But this departure, what is Rick departing from? Well, he's become cynical, and he is a loner. He sticks his neck out for no one, he says. He runs a saloon. He stays out of politics. He throws beautiful women away, according to Louis Renault. And it's this protectionism, which is also in the allegory of World War II, this isolationism. So he's isolated, he's protected, but it's not just from the war. It's actually from his own feelings. And that is what he departs from. That is the home world. When we meet him, he's alone, he's cynical, he's cut off. He doesn't get involved. And that non-involvement gets breached. And he has to face up to it and make a decision. Does he get involved? Does he not get involved? But the safety of him staying in his shell has been broken. So that's the departure. And there's really no call in that sense. It is really thrust upon him. And we see this when Ilsa walks in. And Sam, she has a bit of a conversation with Sam and gets him to play as time goes by. And as soon as he does, Rick comes running out from the back going, "I told you never to play that song." Oh, and then he sees her. There's no turning back. There's no call. It hits him in the face. So he really can't refuse the call or anything like that. It's there. Now you can try, and he does for a little while. He tries to drink it off, but there's no way. And he knows that too. It's kind of over and done with. At least the illusion has been shattered. So now he has to act. Now this is brought back. She is back. The woman who broke his heart is now back in his bar. And who does she bring? Laszlo. On the other hand, Rick knows who Victor Laszlo is. He admires Victor Laszlo for the work that he does. He's like a really, really good version of what Rick used to be, trying to help out the underdog. He's a leader of the Free French movement. This is a very important to the resistance, as well as an important figure for the Nazis who don't want him doing all this resisting. But Rick is not just confronted with her and his feelings. She comes with Laszlo, and Laszlo is somebody that Rick very much admires. So he has this immediate conflict brought in. It's a double-edged sword. It is thrown on him. But wow, I mean, what a thing to be faced with. It's a pretty tall order, and he's not up to it at the beginning. But throughout the movie, we see how his heart unfolds to where he becomes somebody who can do that. Wasn't able to at the beginning, became able to by the end. And before we get to the end, let's get to the midpoint. She's not just back in his bar. She's back in his life, back in his heart, under his skin, if you will. But he has to face it. He has to face her. He has to face his own fears. And he has to, most importantly, face his own feelings. And that's very hard for him at first. He had done a pretty good job of isolating himself, but no longer. Cannot do it. Cannot be sustained. Now, there's a very important scene. They're all important, of course, but there's another story within the story. If in the outer story, the people and the events that are happening in this bar in Casablanca are a metaphor or an allegory, a storied metaphor, an allegory for the outer world of the early years of World War II and America's isolationism, involvement, non-involvement decision that America as a country has to make. If that's to the outer story, then there's an even smaller story within the bar, within the inner story, that speaks to the whole inner story. And that's through this Bulgarian couple who show up at the bar. We see them just little bits throughout, so they're kind of set up. But there's a scene, this is after the second night, and after, or I guess right before, Ilsa and Victor return to the bar on the second night. She approaches Rick, saying that she and her young husband had spent so much money getting to Casablanca, they don't have enough to leave. And apparently, Louis Renault, being the helper that he is, has agreed or certainly offered to help her if she helps him out. So a little tit for tat, a little bit of a favor. But she is asking Rick basically if Louis will keep his word. That if she sleeps with him, she doesn't say it in so many words, but we know, if she sleeps with him, will he then give her and her husband the letters of transit or the exit visas or whatever they need to continue on the next step of their journey? And they want to get to America. So that's what's in their heart. And they're young. This is young, innocent love. And that's a really powerful force that Rick has to face at this point, because it reminds him again of what's really good. And this young woman tells him that she's willing to do this with Louis, but wants to keep it a secret, that if she kept it locked in her heart because she loves this guy so much, would that be okay? And his response is, nobody ever loved me that much. So yes, it's painful for him to hear, but I think at the same time, it sparks something within him. Maybe that's not going to happen for him in his life, at least not now. But it is happening for this young couple in their lives. That he goes back to the casino and sees the husband of the Bulgarian couple losing at roulette. And of course, the house always wins. And I guess in this case, the house lost, but on purpose. And tells him to put all his money on 22 at the roulette table. And of course, it's rigged. And he's able to get enough money to where, A, they can get the exit visas, and B, she won't have to sleep with Louis. So he kind of messed Louis's gig up by doing that. But what he did is he scored a victory for love. Yes, that has an outer component because there's this couple and they want to get out. But he didn't do it for that. He did it because she loves him that much. And she runs up to him afterwards and hugs him and says, thank you. And Rick says he's just a lucky guy. Of course, he's not talking about roulette. Okay. We know what he's really talking about there. So that's a story within a story. It's not so much of an allegory in that it points to a different story or another story. It's actually kind of a micro version, but it's very, very important because it's so condensed into that one sequence that Rick can, through this young couple, he can see what's going on in his life better. So there's sort of a mirroring aspect there. Later on, Ilsa comes back to Rick, tries to convince him, then pulls a gun on him, threatens to shoot him. And Rick does an interesting thing. He moves even closer to her. He doesn't try to grab the gun or run away. It's like, it kind of tells you where he is. He's willing to just take a bullet for the hell of it. Put him out of his misery, not self-sacrifice himself. It's like, yeah, go ahead, shoot me. I don't care at this point. So we really see how hardened and cynical he has become. But that's also a very transformative moment because he sees that she's willing, at least to threaten, to go to such length. And then he sees his, not really wanting to survive. And this appointment with death really turns into an appointment with life, this new life, that the old can't work anymore, that there is a new life, and there's a new way of thinking. And she tells him after they kind of get past the gun issue, she says, well, you have to do the thinking for both of us. Again, a metaphor for the outer world, the story of World War II. But it's also the story of what's happening there and what's happening in Rick's heart. He has to decide. So, yes, there's been fate. There's been circumstance, perhaps destiny playing a hand. But at this point, he can't leave it to chance or anything in the outer world. He has to make the decision himself. And he's the only one who can. And that puts the center of power back on Rick. Not, oh, this person hurt me, or that's going on out there. It's in him now. He has to rise to the occasion and make that decision. Now, Rick's transformation, again, through Louis. We had a rule of threes with Louis last week. We have one this week. He says very early on, again, in the first act, in the departure part, he says he suspects that under his cynical shell, that he's at heart a sentimentalist. And that had something to do with when they were talking about whether or not Rick was going to help Laszlo escape Casablanca, because he's coming in. And so Louis tells him, and tells us, really, reminds Rick that, oh, you used to do this, you worked for the underdog, again, this history that Rick has. And that's enough for Louis to see that maybe he's not. So maybe he knows a little more about love. At least is able to see something a little bit more about Rick than Rick's willing to notice in himself. Now, the second time, it's right after Rick allows the Bulgarian couple to win at roulette. Of course, Louis is a little upset. Hey, you're cutting in on my action here. And he says, just as I expected, a rank sentimentalist. So that got confirmed, and we now have confirmed that. And now Rick, it's not just words. He did something. He did something unselfish and loving. So now it's even more present in Rick's consciousness that he does have this sentimental, unconditional, this unselfish side to him. Inside. That's the side it's on the inside. And at the end, when Rick shoots Major Strausser and permits and insists that Victor Laszlo and Ilsa Lund leave together, taking both the letters of transit, putting him in an incredibly dangerous situation. And of course, Louis tells his policeman to round up the usual suspects instead of the one right in front of him who actually did it. And he goes, not only have you become a sentimentalist, you've become a patriot. And it's interesting because as he says that line, that's right when Louis is holding that bottle of Vichy water. Again, Vichy, the faction of France that was aligned, or at least sympathetic, with the Nazis. And he opens it and goes to take a drink, and then he throws it in the trash. So at that point, Louis has become a patriot as well. We know which side he's on, and it took all this to get to that point. But again, in 3 parts, in 3 acts, we can see through Louis and what Louis says and his observations, really what goes on with Rick and his transformation that he makes in these 3 very event-filled days in Casablanca. And finally, at the return, we're at the airport still. This is Rick returning to who he is. It's his heart returning to his being, allowing his feelings, allowing what's in his heart to help inform his decision, being released from the prison, from the walls that he had built around it. And like I mentioned before, it's not that he's just returning to what he was. He's going back and retrieving who he was, and bringing it forth, and he's really becoming something more than he was. So he was one way, then he became another way, and now he's even yet a third way that's much more like the first way, but more intense, more directed, bigger, stronger, more than he thought he could be. And that's when he sacrifices himself. Now, the play turns out very differently at the end. You may have heard that during the filming of Casablanca, the writers would be driving to the studio going, oh my gosh, these brothers would be talking to each other, who's going to get the letters? What does Victor do? What does Rick do? That they were kind of writing it as they were shooting it. That was back at a time in Hollywood when they were just pumping out movies left and right. So they didn't have a whole lot of time, to develop it. But in the play, it was very different. Victor, Laszlo, and Ilsa do escape with the letters, but Rick does not shoot Major Strausser. In fact, Strausser arrests Rick. So really, it ends with Rick being taken into custody, probably to be, sent to a concentration camp or executed or something, I would imagine. But a very, very dark, very, very sad ending for Rick. So I kind of like the movie version better. Actually, I like it a lot. As you can tell, I like this movie. Yeah, I guess you could have guessed. And in doing this, Rick is really releasing Ilsa from his heart. Now, he's partly releasing her, or he's releasing her from a part of himself, or that selfish part of his heart. That says, if you love me, I'm happy. If you leave me, I'm sad. If you like me, I'm there for you. If you don't, then I don't like you. That kind of very, we remember from high school how things, early love can be. It's kind of an immature, but it's also somebody who's been kind of beaten down with life, that would get that attitude as well. So he's releasing her from that part of him, having those chains attached to her. But it also opens up another part. And we see this in the Paris flashback when he looks at her and holds her chin and says, here's looking at you, kid. He says it a bunch of times. And then he says it again at the end. And we see, there's an age difference between the two. And this is where he becomes, a little more like Laszlo, that he's looking after her, regardless of his feelings, regardless of his safety. So that's a pretty incredible transformation. And he tells her, we'll always have Paris. That good that they had, that they once had back then, even through all this, or maybe because of all this, that they'll still have that. But it's at a different place and a different time, where it belongs, where it was happy, before the Germans came in, before she left him, abandoned him on this rainy train station, and didn't leave with him. So we see where she is now in his heart, which has everything to do with where the condition and how his heart is working. And it seems to be working quite a bit better. And there's this unconditional love in a way that he shows towards Laszlo, because, he's making possible the woman he loves, the woman he probably loved more than any other woman that Rick loved, is giving her and her husband, Victor Laszlo, these letters of transit. And that's a loving thing for him too, or that Rick is showing towards Laszlo, because they're both in love with the same woman. And he knew how hard it was to have her leave him back in Paris. And we know why from the movie, of course. So he wishes them both well and gets them on their way. That for Laszlo to be the leader of the resistance, and to be so in love, to be a man as well, as a leader, be so in love with Ilsa. And Rick knows how much Ilsa loves Victor. In fact, the only reason why she fell in love with Rick back in Paris is, of course, we know from the earlier part, that was because she had thought that Victor had died, apparently in a prison or something, or trying to escape. So then, of course, she finds out he's still alive, and that's why she ditched Rick and went back to him. But this very giving, this very loving, this turning over, Rick knows that for Victor Laszlo to really be the person he needs to be to lead this movement, the Free French, and Charles de Gaulle and that whole resistance movement against the Nazis, he needs to be a complete person as well, and that includes being married to Ilsa Lund and having her with him. Again, this power of love, this divine feminine, this, he, in a way, Victor needs her more than Rick does. Or maybe in some way he feels that because Victor's a different person. Victor Laszlo is a different person than Rick Blaine, and Rick knows that. Maybe in some way he feels that Ilsa deserves better than Rick, than himself. And this person that he admires, Victor Laszlo, is better suited for her. But either way, it's better for the resistance, it's better for Victor, and it's really better for everybody. And we talked about this last week when Laszlo turns to Rick and says, "Welcome back to the fight. This time I know our side is going to win." And we were talking about the outer story and the allegory with World War II. Very clear on the surface. Rick is back to the fight. He gives aid to the resistance against America in the body of Rick. And Laszlo says, "Hey, welcome back. We're going to win now because America's on our side." That's in the outer story. But that's not what he's saying. Same line of dialogue. But that's not what he means on the end. This is two parts of the story, the two sides. And they're so strong and so throughout the thing that when he says, "Welcome back to the fight, this time I know our side is going to win," he's also talking about love. He's also talking about men, and he's also talking about love. And that is the side Rick returned to. Not just the side out there fighting against the Nazis, fighting for freedom. No, this is for love. And with love, with this divine feminine, with this connection to what is wonderful, what is beautiful, what is innocent, what is worth living and fighting for and sacrificing for, that's the side that's going to win. And that's what Victor's really talking about, my opinion. And ultimately what we have is a tale of redemption, that everything Rick had done, good or not so good, is really brought back. And his soul, his consciousness, his karma, if you will, is probably pretty well cleared up by the end of the movie. Now he's, got to be on the run, and he killed a pretty important, at least locally important, German officer. So, he's got that on his hands. But really what he did was unselfish, and it redeemed really anything that was ever wrong, and every thought or action that he had in the past, completely redeemed through love, through his unselfish sacrifice for love when he gave the letters of transit to Victor Laszlo and Ilsa Lund so they can continue on. And this is the inner story of Casablanca. Look forward to next week.